Okie dokie. 최고. Let's go! Hi! Let's go! Okie
Apparently, AlphaDream had been looking over at their desk neighbor Capcom for some new ideas that the company could appropriate for their quirky role-playing game that they were in the middle of finishing, because this whole Koopaling boss rush that the developers put in could be ripped straight out of any Mega Man game without anyone noticing. The main justification for boss rushes is that they try to build up to the final encounter, and most of the time, the effect that actually happens is just making the player dig through an entire refuse bin of half-cobbled together ideas to get to what they actually want to do in the first place. If you even mention the words Great Maze, you'll have Nintendo fans lamenting in absolute agony over what an amazingly poor job HAL Laboratories did with that one. So I had to deal with fighting all of the Koopalings in moderate succession in a level that seemed tailor-made to piss players off, but instead of blaming AlphaDream for ratcheting the difficulty into the ceiling, I'm more gonna blame myself for the inability to deal with anything in the Bowser's Castle level. Do yourselves a favor, and before you even think about going to Bablanadon again, go back to Bean Bean Castle Town and pick up the General Badge and Queen Bean Pants, because those two turn Mario and Luigi into agile tanks. It is ridiculously unfair if you have those on in this level. Otherwise, you'll be dealing with a handful of boss fights that'll be set to kick your ass into tiny pieces. At this point in the game, I figured out the usefulness of Luigi's Thunder Hand combo, which turned most of the Koopaling bosses into absolute cakewalks, beating them outright in about 3 turns. Most of the challenge in these fights is getting them into the first place, since AlphaDream gave everyone gimmicks. There's one where you have to do an obstacle course with altered controls, one where you have to solve a position puzzle, another where you have to play jump rope, and what makes those not fun is that the activities are completely pointless. If you fail, the game just dumps you right at the start of the game for another attempt, and if you aren't punishing the player for failing these pre-fight minigames, then why are they even here? In the later Koopaling fights like Ludwig and Wendy, they start adding insta-kill time limits to the fight, which aren't too bad if you can get them with the Thunder Hand technique and then just beat them into the ground. What really screws these bosses is that some of them have ridiculously hard to dodge and high damage attacks, like Ludwig, who can hit Mario and Luigi a total of 6 times with one attack, and you probably aren't at your best anymore since the other Koopalings already burned through a heavy chunk of your health items before you even met this guy. The entire string of having 7 bosses one after another isn't hyping me up for the last encounter. At best, all it's doing is increasing the distance between player and credits. If you want to have a fireworks display of a final level, then that's fine. Heck, it'd be more satisfying to have the player run through a whole gamut of final challenges to make getting to the final boss a reward. Ultimately, the Koopalings boss rush of Superstar Saga is just annoying, which is a shame since the Bowser's Castle level had some great puzzles to wrap up the game. But since this is what we have to deal with, just make sure to get the new badges and armor before flying up to this castle. You'll definitely thank me in the long run.